Thank you. Okay, so good morning, everybody. I'm very grateful to the organizers for this invitation. When I was reading the program of the symposium, I realized that we have many research and transformation interests that we share. So I'm really looking forward to listening to all your contributions. I have prepared a talk that hopefully can be complementary to your contributions. First, I will start talking a bit about the paper and conservation letters that Joeri was mentioning. Then I will explain what happened afterwards in terms of some research projects that we started. In the third part, I will be talking a bit about transformative change and the trigger of transformation. Then I will focus on self-transformation, and then I will finally conclude. I will take questions and comments at the end of the talk. So let's start straight away with the first part. In April 2020, we published this review paper in Conservation Letters. It was a big group of conservation ecologists and ecological economists. It was a short paper, 5-6 pages, but about 1.5 pages were only for the affiliations and the names of the co-authors. It was cool to do that. It was an attempt to integrate the criticism of economic growth on the one hand with the question of biodiversity conservation on the other hand. It started in a workshop at an International Congress of Conservation Biology in Montpellier, France in 2015. And the paper has 3 main messages that I will briefly summarize. The first one is that economic growth contributes to biodiversity loss by 3 mechanisms that are triggered by an increase in the use and trade of resources. So this is the sequence. Economic growth triggers an increase in the use and trade of resources, matter, and energy. This triggers 3 mechanisms of biodiversity loss: climate change, land use change, and invasive species. These 3 mechanisms were and are well known, of course, but the systematic link to economic growth was lacking. And what we did in this paper is to show this link by reviewing different studies on social metabolism, the Kuznets curve, and the state and pressures, biodiversity state and pressures, with a very simple model that I will problematize later on. In the paper, we acknowledge several cases of relative decoupling, which is, as you know, when GDP grows faster than the impacts are still growing. This has happened in raw materials, in human appropriation of net primary productivity, in CO2 emissions, okay? And then we acknowledge also in the paper a few cases of absolute decoupling, which is when GDP grows while the total impacts on the environment and on biodiversity decline. And this is the case of the impacts on birds due to agriculture and forestry activities in Europe and North America, taking into account trade effects. This is a paper by Marquez and colleagues that was published in Nature, Ecology and Evolution in 2019, showing partial evidence of absolute decoupling for some regions. But in any case, this absolute decoupling is not global nor fast enough to ensure conservation. The second message of the paper is that there is something wrong in international environmental policies. We found that many of them strongly encourage economic growth. You can take a look at the paper for some examples. And then we classify them according to their vision on the relationship between economic growth and biodiversity, whether they think that economic growth is problematic or unproblematic for biodiversity, or whether the relationship is just the vision is just ambiguous, okay? And there were 7 policy documents of sustainability, like general documents like the Brundtland Report, Sustainable Development Goals, and 21 policy documents specific to biodiversity, like, for example, the Convention on Biological Diversity and related documents of the Conference of the Parties. We found that most of them have an ambiguous vision. Some of them consider that economic growth is not a problem for biodiversity, and only 6 out of the 28 documents analyzed consider that growth is a problem for biodiversity. It is important to highlight that our analysis covered the period 1972-2016, which is when the review was being conducted, but that in 2019, the IPBES Global Assessment acknowledged that we need to move away from the growth paradigm in order to conserve biodiversity, which I think is a good sign. And finally, the third message of the paper is that we could use the Convention on Biological Diversity and the IPBES as platforms to test alternative policies and in particular scenarios. The IPBES biodiversity scenarios use the SSP. SSP are shared socioeconomic pathways, which are basically descriptions of alternative societal trajectories in terms of the economy, of population, of policies, which are then coupled to models of environmental change. The SSP that are available nowadays are 5, SSP 1 to 5, and you can see them here. They have different economic growth rates, but all of them have positive economic growth rates. In other words, all SSP that are available assume that the economy is going to continue growing and that this is desirable. And then they have different conservation outcomes, which you can see here. This is adapted from the climate change literature to the case of biodiversity conservation. IPBES use 3 SSPs to inform the global assessment. It's SSP1, which is called sustainability. It's similar to a green growth scenario. Then SSP3, which is a situation where countries focus inwards, there is no cooperation, and the environment degrades. And then SSP5, which is basically strengthening social development based on fossil fuels and then relying on technology to reduce the impacts of this development. So our proposal was to actually expand the solution space with a new SSP that we call SSP0 or beyond economic growth, and that would consider low, zero, or even negative economic growth pathways that are compatible with ambitious biodiversity targets. We describe in the paper this SSP0, where basically there is a rise in the collective awareness of our impacts in the planet. This triggers a transition to a smaller economy, which is also more just. Technology is used to liberate time for introspection and learning, and I will come to this later on. And this triggers a change in social priorities away from economic growth towards well-being and nature. So the attention is shifted from growth towards something else. That's important. And this SSP0 contains some degrowth policies like resource caps, limits to large infrastructures, work reduction schemes, etc., that could be tested and evaluated. These are some of the keywords of our SSP0. And just mention also that there are current calls in the same direction. O'Neill and colleagues in Nature Climate Change and Hickel and colleagues some weeks ago in Nature Energy are all arguing for the inclusion of non-growth, post-growth, or degrowth scenarios in climate change policy and scenario development. In this second part, I will explain what happened after the paper in terms of new research avenues that were started with some colleagues. First of all, the IPBES working group on scenarios published a very friendly reply to our paper in conservation letters that you can see here. Basically, what they said is that their scenario framework is not only based on SSP, that we were focusing too much on SSP in our proposal. They said that SSP were necessary to inform the global assessment that was published in 2019, and that's why they use them. But now they say that they're using a wider framework that basically accounts for a diversity of human-nature relationships. This is the framework that they use. This diversity of relationships leads to different values. Nature can have value for itself, its intrinsic value. Nature can have value for society, its instrumental value, or nature can be seen as culture, and this is a relational value. And out of these different values, they say there are different positive visions about the future that emerge, and they are using these positive visions of the future to model the new scenarios. Very good. So they said basically that it's not about adding an SSP, as we say in our paper. Very good. but we really enjoyed their reply. But for us, it's not clear if IPBES is going to model scenarios beyond economic growth, and if so, how to do it. I personally don't know how to do it, but I hope to find out in a couple of projects that I will present next. Let me first mention a weak point, the main weak point of our paper, which is that we only provide correlational evidence, meaning that economic growth changes alongside indicators of biodiversity impacts, and the two are correlated. This is an example quoted in our paper where you see the evolution of GDP and the evolution of endangered and threatened species in the US, and the two are correlated. But the correlation, as you know, between two factors does not imply that one is the cause of the other. And strictly speaking, with the evidence that we have in the paper, we cannot really say that economic growth is the cause of biodiversity loss. So in the first project that I would like to present is by Stanislas Rigal, very brilliant young researcher from the University of Montpellier. He suggested that I use causality in brackets very wisely, because we are talking about mathematical causality, which may or may not correspond to reality. The idea of his project is to go deeper in causality analysis using something called convergent cross-mapping and other methods. This convergent cross-mapping is used by Liu and colleagues in this paper, who found out that in, just a question, can you see the screen properly? Or do you see the pictures with your videos? No?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, perfect. Then it's all good. I just wanted to make sure. So basically, Liu and colleagues found out that in some cases, like for example, France, there is a bidirectional causality between economic growth and resource consumption or impacts. Here, they make correlations between time series of economic growth and energy consumption. In the vertical axis, you have the correlation coefficient, and the horizontal axis, you have the length of the time series analyzed. And then red is the case where energy consumption is the cause of economic growth. And in black, you have the opposite. Economic growth is the cause of energy consumption. And as you see that P is lower than 0.05 in both cases, you can say both things. You can say that economic growth triggers energy consumption, which is the rationale of our paper, but you can also say that energy consumption triggers or facilitates economic growth. And this was one of the criticisms of the reviewers to our paper when looking at our model. So based on this, Stanislas would like to use some different data of birds, butterfly, and forest area, GDP, and population data to explore the consequences of growth and of degrowth for biodiversity. And he would like to choose some geographical areas, the state of Chiapas in Mexico, which could be considered similar to a degrowth scenario, where there is a stable GDP and a grassroots movement in favor of autonomy. Then we would have the Soviet Union, which is a case of negative GDP leading to a crisis. It's a case of recession. And then we have the global north, where the question is, what would be the impacts of a degrowth scenario for our agricultural landscapes? Would they be intensified to produce everything that we produce outside? Or would maybe the landscapes that we have abandoned in the 19th and 20th century would they start being used again for agriculture? And what would be the impact of all this for biodiversity? The second project that I would like to present is Valparc. It's a project that belongs to the Swiss biodiversity strategy of the federal government, which is going to assess the state, the trends, and the values of nature's contributions to people, and develop scenarios for a functional ecological infrastructure. Ecological infrastructure is similar to green infrastructure, and it's basically a network of natural and semi-natural areas that is protected or managed to ensure biodiversity, and the flow of NCPs to society. And as part of this objective, we co-developed visions for ecological infrastructure in the future with stakeholders in the 4 natural parks we work with. We identified with them how are the parks in 2060, how is biodiversity, how are nature's contributions to people in these visions. And in one of them, some of the stakeholders mentioned that degrowth was necessary for a functional ecological infrastructure in the future. So it was not something nice to have, but something that was necessary, like a must, to ensure a proper ecological infrastructure in the future. And I promise that I did not talk to them in advance. It was really by chance. It was actually in the same breakout room where I was that this was mentioned. So the question is now how to incorporate this in the scenarios. How are scenarios developed in Valpark? This is done by the team of Zurich, the Polytechnical University in Zurich. And basically the pathways from current to future ecological infrastructure are modeled under 2 approaches. The first one is the forecasting approach, where the state of ecological infrastructure in the present is projected under business as usual and other scenarios of socioeconomic and climate change. And then we have the backcasting vision. Basically, we start from stakeholder visions that I have just presented, and we model backwards to understand the key changes that we need to do in the system today to realize those visions. And then the model basically simulates land use and land cover change based on historic patterns, on biophysical and socioeconomic predictors, on policies, which can be modified policies or new policies. And then this simulation of land use and land cover change is used to model ecosystem services and biodiversity, which are in turn proxies for ecological infrastructure. It's a bit complicated, but the question is how to translate a scenario beyond economic growth like SSP0 in this approach. I think it would be very cool to have such a scenario for a country like Switzerland. So all this is about causality between economic growth and biodiversity loss. For me, the question is, why are we interested in causality? I think, or at least I am interested because I want to find out the underlying cause of current environmental problems and at the same time the key to solving them. And so the trigger. And in this 3rd part, I will share with you a bit what I've learned about transformation and transformative change. Transformative change meaning profound alterations in social ecological interactions to sustain the Earth's ecosystems and at the same time ensure global well-being. So not superficial change, but one that deals with the root of the problems. But first, let me situate our conceptual framework in a broader one, the IBES framework, where there are indirect drivers of change like governance and institutions, which affect direct drivers of change, which in turn affect nature or biodiversity, the flow of nature contributions to people, and finally, the quality of life. So our framework is just a small part of this red square, where if you remember, we have economic growth that can be considered an indirect driver, triggers changes in climate change, land use change, and so on, which are direct drivers of change, and this affects the state of biodiversity. But the relationships between humans and nature are multidimensional and much more complex than this, and probably also the necessary transformations. So there are different tools to understand transformative change that you probably know. The first one I would like to mention is by O'Brien and Signa. They talk about 3 interrelated spheres that drive transformation: the personal sphere, including values and worldviews; the political sphere, which are the structures shaping social ecological systems and determining the range and the possibilities for action. And then we have the practical sphere, which includes behaviors and technical responses, which nowadays captures most of the attention of policymakers and the media. Then there is another framework that I find interesting, is the IPBES framework on transformative change, which is based on the concept of leverage points. Leverage points basically places in a system where small changes lead to a large shift. It's used in systems analysis, but according to Donella Meadows, one of the main system thinkers in the world, this concept of leverage point is also present in the legends. In the legends, there is always the secret passage, the magic password, the recipe allowing to overcome huge obstacles and transform things. So some of the leverage points used by IPBES, I think, are very relevant for our symposium today. First of all, is embrace visions of good life away from economic growth, reduce total material consumption, and unleash latent values of responsibility for nature. Leverage points are supposed to change indirect drivers, and these are supposed to change direct drivers and improve the state of biodiversity. By the way, Meadows recognizes that the most effective leverage point is changing the paradigm of a society, the deep beliefs about how the world works. And this is roughly equivalent to the personal sphere in O'Brien and Signa. So there are different tools to understand transformative change. The question is, how can we assess if transformative change is happening on the ground? And in this paper led by Ignacio Palomo, we analyze nature-based solutions to assess transformative change. Nature-based solutions are actions to manage or restore ecosystems that provide both a benefit for biodiversity and for well-being. And we developed this framework integrating different components of transformative change. You see here the three spheres of transformation and the different elements. And then the 6 indicators of transformative change that I will explain in a minute. And then we apply this framework to 93 nature-based solutions implemented in mountain regions globally, which are described in a participatory database of IUCN. This database contains different types of nature-based solutions that address certain challenges like poverty, for example, and have certain outcomes in terms of biodiversity and good quality of life. And what we did is to code the information and to check how all these elements are related. For example, this is just an example. You see below, you find the types of nature's values underpinning the nature-based solutions, which belong to the personal sphere. And above, you have the outcomes of these nature-based solutions, always as reported by the informants, in terms of biodiversity, NCPs, and good quality of life. And we found that intrinsic values often associate with improving biodiversity, whereas instrumental and relational values often relate with enhancing NCPs. But in the paper, there are many more examples of these connections. We created also clusters of nature-based solutions to understand transformative change. There are 3 broad clusters and 8 subtypes. I will not go into detail. Basically, the first cluster are nature-based solutions that address human impacts on biodiversity using conservation and restoration actions. The second one is similar, but they also address questions of poor governance and participation, which are very important. And the third cluster is basically nature-based solutions that address climate change and associated drought and erratic rainfall. And then what we did is also to apply the 6 indicators of transformative change by Fedele and colleagues to our nature-based solutions to illustrate profound changes. And there are path-shifting changes, restructuring changes, multi-scale changes when the solutions happen and integrate different scales, innovative when there are new ideas coming out in the social system, system-wide where, for example, you reach the whole catchment and you can create changes at the level of the whole catchment, and then persistent when the changes persist in time. For me, one of the crucial questions is, what is the role of scientists in transformative change? We speak a lot about social ecological systems, but what is the role of us as scientists? As you know, inter and transdisciplinarity emerged some decades ago to respond to environmental problems, to find solutions, but actually it is not clear how inter and transdisciplinarity is contributing to transformative change. And we need to assess this. And in this paper, we assess the Interdisciplinary Center for Mountain Research, which is a pilot center of the University of Lausanne, where I work. And we used a simple model of 6 components. We have, for example, the object, which is what is it that we are studying. We have the subject, which is who or what exactly are we. We have the institutional context, which is what kind of institutional support do we receive to conduct our research and to help transform mountain regions towards sustainability. And here we find out that we really need new evaluation standards and new funding policies that really value interdisciplinary experience. Otherwise, for the researchers in a competitive environment, it's very difficult to engage in this kind of research. And well, then we show also that the components interact and so on. I don't have the time now to go into detail, but I would like to say is that we added one element in this model. It's called serendipity, which is basically the ability to use unexpected happenings or unexpected discoveries in creative ways. And we argue that serendipity should be considered an essential component of interdisciplinarity. For example, we unexpectedly discovered that interdisciplinarity and transdisciplinarity requires a transformation of researchers. This is a quote from one researcher that I interviewed, and she says our research center is a space that contributes to changing the way we do research, where it is necessary to let go of our egos. And then our director, when presenting the center in several occasions, he said, actually, in our center, we're not only doing research on mountains, but we are also doing research on ourselves. Let me make here a first distinction between ego and self. Ego are those ideas about us with which we feel identified. For example, I am a brilliant natural scientist or environmental scientist, and the way I conduct research, my methods, my theories are the truth. That's the ego. And this researcher was pointing out at the fact that to make interdisciplinarity possible, we need to let go of these ideas to integrate other scientific and non-scientific perspectives. The self is a deeper notion, and the ego is considered the center of personality. If you allow me, the expression is also the essence of human beings. It's something that is not yet conscious, something that needs to be discovered, and is also the object of spiritual search, the self. So we realized actually in that model that I showed you before, that the research object is the subject. And this is called self-reflexivity in science. So by surprise, by serendipity, we realized that doing science is not only about discovering objects out there, but is also about discovering and changing ourselves within. So science and spirituality seem to share goals, and that was a finding that came completely by surprise. And I'd like to talk in this last part about this trip from the ego to the self, because I feel it's a necessary step to shift our attention from economic growth to nature and well-being, and make the SSP0 and other similar scenarios possible. This is a work in progress based on ongoing research, so I ask for your patience and open-mindedness on this. Actually, the question is, can scientists be transformed by doing research on nature, especially interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research? And in the project that I told you about before, Valpark, I am conducting some research on this, where the focus is our team, researchers and the stakeholders we work with. This is a summary of an interview with one of our researchers where he explained his evolution, and I will read. He said, I was trained as a conservation biologist in a very biocentric approach, but during my postdoc, I worked with a director that had an anthropocentric approach, which I found cool. I gradually moved towards the ecosystem surveys approach. Then I became a lecturer, and in order to prepare my courses, I started reading about the socioeconomic challenges of sustainability. I learned that things are not right or wrong, but just a negotiation between different visions of the good society. In this journey, I realized that some conservation biologists can have very closed views and be aggressive towards people with different visions or values on nature. I use science very much as a way to better understand myself, my biases, and my mistakes. So he's examining how biocentric values changed as he encountered different colleagues, how he became more open to other values about nature, and finally he stresses that science about nature, his research, his career, is a way to better understand himself. But what does actually mean to better know oneself? This is a quote from another researcher I interviewed, where she said, "Some places I visited, I saw them as wild. By wild, I mean the capacity of that area to make me feel in a certain way. I feel myself as part of a shared universe. We are social animals, and we look for sharing life experiences and goals. Because of this need," she said, "I feel part of something bigger than just physical community of humans." Did you ever have this sensation that you are very happy and you don't have limits in your body, that you are connected to everything? This vision of life and spirituality guides my conservation and scientific practice. So basically, she starts saying that wild places make her feel in a certain way. Then she shares the experience of being limitless and connected to the whole. My feeling is that her description goes beyond the mental explanation. It really seems an actual experience, quite deep. So the discovery of the self seems to be about happiness, about joy, about satisfaction with oneself, about collective consciousness also. And if this is the case, in this trip, my feeling is that the importance of affluence, of material things, greed, and economic growth is likely to diminish as well. So, and I'm now finishing. How am I trying to make sense of these preliminary insights? The only way I have found is through the theory of Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. He described the ego as the center of the conscious mind and the self as the totality of human being, which is made of both conscious and unconscious psyche, okay? And then he described a crucial process in human beings called individuation, which is the process through which one becomes the self. It generates a psychological individual, which in Jung, and this might be a bit difficult to understand, in Jung, an individual has a collective nature, okay? So in self-realization or individuation, which is the same, an unconscious reality becomes conscious and we become aware of something we did not know about ourselves. And Jung tells us that this happens through symbols. Anything can be a symbol, a tree, a mother and the child, a dragon. Anything can be a symbol as long as its meaning for us is not yet known, okay? The example that I will put here is this mandala. Mandala is an example of a symbol. This one is drawn by Jung himself. It comes from the Red book. And basically it depicts the self as the center of personality. And then the ego is in the periphery, and the mandala connects both. That's why painting or coloring mandalas have healing and transformation properties. So for me, the question now is, how do people, and in particular scientists, experiencing individuation, how do they change their relationship to the environment? Can we say that this process is a leverage point or a trigger of transformation to sustainability? And if so, why? But this is becoming a bit too mystical for a scientific lecture, and I'm afraid I won't be invited again. So before it's too late, let me recap a bit and provide some conclusions. I think that it's more and more difficult to deny that economic growth has a negative effect on biodiversity. Biodiversity and other policies, in particular economic policies, need to be adapted to take this into account. One research and policy priority, I think now, is to develop new scenarios beyond economic growth. There is a lot now in the literature about this, and hopefully more in the future. I mean, about the call to do that, not about the actual scenarios. For me, it's also difficult to claim that economic growth is the underlying cause of biodiversity loss, because if this is the case, what is the underlying cause of economic growth? Why did human beings in general take that path? And then finally, we saw that transformations to sustainability are multidimensional. I think that values and paradigms may play a crucial role. I feel that there is a need for scientists to become more aware of their transformation, of their role in these transformations. This might mean reflecting or observing our own transformation away from our disciplinary and also ideological egos. And then I speculated with the possibility that self-realization or individuation, in particular in scientists, might be a crucial leverage point for a transformation to sustainability. And with this, I finish. I would like to thank you all very much for your attention. Here are the references in case you are interested, and I'm happy to answer to your questions if I can.
Thank you so much, Iago. Let us see whether there are hands raised or questions in the chat. And if not, then I will take the opportunity to ask the first question. Carmen, there are questions?
I see questions from Kenneth, Graylis, and
Okay,
Marco.
okay, yes. So let's start with a question from Marco.
We cannot hear you, Marco.
You hear me now?
Yes.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. Thank you very much for the presentation. It was very, very interesting. And thank you very much also for the publication of 2020. It was a great read. I have a question about your work and how you connect your work on beyond growth, so the paper of 2020, with your last work that you showed us about transformation. Because there are different ways of intending transformation, and some, like also Ipe's acknowledges, some goes towards a growth-based type of transformation, and instead other type of transformations are more radical, like post-capitalist and degrowth transformation. In your latest work on nature-based conservation, were you trying to assess whether these transformations were going towards a post-growth scenario, or you were only assessing the transformation in itself, whether any transformation was happening?
You mean in the paper on nature-based solutions by Palomo and colleagues? Yeah. That paper was an assessment of nature-based solutions, and what we did there was to combine different frameworks that exist in the literature analyzing transformative change. We integrated those different frameworks, and we used the new framework to assess whether transformative change is happening on the ground. There are different elements, including values and worldviews, and you could say that there is a space for, accounting for values or visions beyond economic growth. So in theory, this framework could allow us to track those transformations and to see how radical in that sense they are. But in the paper, you can take a look. We don't notice that we don't see that in the description of the nature-based solutions that are provided by the participants in the database. So economic growth there and the criticism to economic growth does not seem to play a role. But in theory, the framework could be used to assess other kind of transformations, maybe from different movements or from different policies, and whether they go in the direction of post-growth and so on. Thank you.
Kaelis, would you like to go next?
Thanks, Iago, for your presentation. I enjoyed the spiritual side too. A nice touch in the morning for us. So if I may, I have two questions. I'll try to be brief. You seem to be reflecting a lot about, is growth an underlying cause or not? And I wonder if that is really the question, because you refer to a paper by Liu where they talked about economic growth and energy consumption as being a sort of circular relationship. So do we need to look for growth as the underlying cause if it's part of a feedback loop like that? I think that argument doesn't undermine your causal model, it just strengthens it, because growth then becomes, it speeds itself up exponentially because of that feedback. So it's not perhaps the question of, is growth the underlying cause? Maybe linked to that is the capitalist system is part of that question. It's a particular system that grows in a particular way. My second, so would you sort of agree with that? I wanted to have your comment on that. And the second one is, in Paloma, you showed a diagram where poverty was seen as a challenge. I was wondering why you don't put it as an outcome, especially if this global system, economic growth system, is actually, grabbing the ecosystems, undermining the local ecosystem services, and actually creating poverty because of this loss of previously free ecosystem services. That was a comment on that paper.
So on the first point, I very much agree with you. We really don't need to look at whether growth is an underlying cause or not. And you're right that I put a lot of attention on that. The reason is because I come from the degrowth community, and this seems to be a crucial point. If the growth is the underlying cause, then we need to do something about it. So my presentation is like my step towards your opinion, so to say. So for me now, it's not so important to look at that, but to look rather at deeper causes of values, paradigm, and so on. So taking into account that economic growth is, of course, still can be considered an indirect driver of change. So in the first point, I very much agree with you. On the second point, whether poverty can be considered an outcome of nature-based solutions. So take into account that this paper, we analyze nature-based solutions as reported by the people that implemented nature-based solutions. So in this database, it's called Panorama. It's by IUCN. You can take a look. There are many descriptions of nature-based solutions by the solutions providers. So it's biased towards the positive outcomes. The solution provider will never say that, this created this and this and this problem, or maybe you can say, but it's slightly biased towards the positive outcomes, and we recognize that. But instead, what we did is that we coded what challenges the nature-based solutions were intended to address, and that's why poverty is at the beginning as the challenges and not the outcome. But thank you, very, very relevant questions.
Kenneth, would you like to follow?
Yes. Firstly, thank you very much for your very interesting lecture, Dr. Otero. I myself have a background in the earth science and ecology, and me and my colleagues investigate the effects of how humans change the face of our planet. And I noticed that your work is also looking in finding causality between economic growth systems and the deterioration or destruction of our nature and exploitation of the mineral resources. What kind of avenue would you advocate in order to investigate further to well, to either collect the evidence or falsify the idea that economic growth systems are actually at cost of our planetary resources and nature. Imagine you would have all the kind of data and resources we have on the planet. What kind of research line would you propose to continue this?
Thank you, Kenneth. There are three things that come to my mind. The first one is to, as I said, try to deepen a bit the causality analysis in the sense of not looking only at one factor, economic growth, but looking at different factors. There is the paper of Marquez and colleagues in Nature, Ecology and Evolution, which I think is crucial. There they separate between the impacts of growth, population, and efficiency. So there is the EPAT question, no? Population, affluence, and technology, and they try to see what are the difference between these different factors in bird extinction. And they find out that growth contributes more, economic growth contributes more than population growth, for example. So this would be one of the things I would do. And the project with Stanislas Rigal that I mentioned goes in this direction, understanding better the causality and taking into account different factors. And the second thing is the geography. What we do in the paper is to analyze macro data, GDP data at the country and regional level, but macro data, as you know, hides a lot of things. We need to know if, for example, countries in Europe have been exporting a lot of production elsewhere, what are the impacts in the other countries? And for this, you need to do assessments of value chains and how this is linked to impacts on biodiversity. And I found out that there are some studies on this, especially analyzing the impacts of bioeconomy for Europe. Yep. Where do the resources come from and the impacts of biodiversity elsewhere? And this is something that should be integrated. Otherwise, without this geographic component, macro data is a bit, what can I say? Yeah, it lacks some information.
Absolutely.
And then finally, I would work on the question of scenarios.
Yes.
How can we project different scenarios for the future, and how can we imagine scenarios beyond economic growth? I would say these three things.
Beautiful. Thank you so much for the inspiration.
Thank you.
Okay. Iago, I think before closing this first session, I'd like to squeeze in my question. I was triggered by your quotes by one of the researchers that you interviewed on tolerance to other views about nature, and sometimes this is also something that I struggle with, how to remain tolerant to people that hold completely opposite views about nature. I think this is a rather big question given the time that we have, but possibly a few thoughts, and then I think we can go into the break after that.
Yeah, it is indeed a big question. I don't have the definite answer. It was a very nice interview in the sense that he showed like an evolution of his values and moving from a biocentric to another approach, you know. But then, yeah, the question is, how can, as you say, how can we be tolerant to people that have opposite visions on nature? The answer is, I don't know. I think there are two approaches. One is to try to integrate them. And it's an approach based on consensus. I'm now living in Switzerland. In Switzerland, consensus is very much a way of doing politics, consensus. Try to reach an agreement with people that have opposing views. And this is happening, for example, in the case of the natural parks. The natural parks in Switzerland are a tool to contribute to the conservation of biodiversity, but presented in a way that is appealing to the local stakeholders, which find it very scary to have nature protected because it's a threat to primary activities. So natural parks, it's a strategy to get a consensus with those actors from the federal office and for the environment and biocentric approaches. That's one approach. Another approach is, okay, you can say we need agonistic approaches, so approaches that integrate somehow the different visions. If you think that nature is not important, and I think that nature is important, in the solution we can kind of integrate this disagreement somehow. I don't know, just by acknowledging that there is a disagreement. These are two general approaches, but I guess then in any case, in each case, in each project or in each debate, we need to find out how to integrate. I don't have a definitive answer. Yeah, but thanks a lot for the comment.
Thank you so much for your answer. We have a very brief break until we start with the next session. So let us go for a coffee or other drink if you like, and be back in a minute or two.